are live with Red Dead Redemption 2. This is Ansel Arnold, and this is my first playthrough of Red Dead Redemption, and I will be playing while giving a little bit of commentary and narrative analysis. I think this is part 6. Something like that. I think it's part 6. We'll see. But been playing through the game. Yep. Been getting somewhere. And been, kind of expecting what would have been coming up against for the most part, as I've been explaining this whole time, I guess. I knew what happened in the narrative. That wasn't so that's not a surprise to me. And then I even watched a fucking video earlier, like hour and a half ago, a couple hours ago, about specifically the part I'm on too. I don't know why. I just couldn't wait. I was just that's kind of how I've been as of late. As I've been working on this essay that I am about this game and its relation to the Western genre, and also to the concept of racial geographies, which I think is, which I'm trying to, argue is central to the Western. It's kind of almost like the Western's defining feature, in a sense. I think. But even though that's kind of a broad statement, because racialized geography is kind of a really broad stroke, in a sense that it talks about or I guess it basically kind of encompasses the, maybe say something like the visual formations of colonial space-making efforts, which are settlement and expansion. And by that I mean by colonial space-making efforts, I kind of literally, I think it really means just, even at the core, is really just the kind of spaces that coloniality, so ideologies of colonialism, ways of living that are rooted in colonialism, the kind of relationship that they have to space, and they, God, go away, I don't want to talk to this guy. He's going to come up to me, I know it. But the relationship that they have with space and, with space making, kind of what their relationship of space making looks like. Well, and in the book Indian Given, by Maria Saldana Portillo, she talks about specifically the Mexico-America borderlands, but specifically talks about racial geographies in terms of, Spanish colonization, and the specific racial geographies that created, and in the ways that it still, kind of permeates the land, and the visual, recognition of like the borderlands and what that all signifies, right? So that's specifically what she talks about, and that space. But I don't think that that I don't think she's closing it off to that as the only kind of space that is racially kind of made. That's the only kind of racial geography. Because if racial geographies occur within a kind of marked landscape of, you know, and of colonialism, really, which is ways of looking at the land, you know, I mean, and by that, you know, I could say even looking at something like landscape painting or even landscape photography today generally, maybe not like Robert Adams or anything like that, or like new topographers. That's kind of, I mean, that's a good example. Like if you're familiar, or if you were to look up, you know, the new topographies, which was a photography exhibit, specifically a landscape photography exhibit that happened, I think, in the 70s, where these artists got together and you know, showed their work, which presented like these new ways of seeing land, right? And I think that we could definitely perhaps have a discussion about, you know, how that might even have some kind of relation to racial geographies. In that, like that might hold in itself a kind of racial geography because, um, you know, we're still coming from a position where they're majority white artists talking from a perspective that is, you know, not just colonial, like in origin, but like kind of made to be involved in colonial's origins rather than being like an outsider. Like if you are black, or even if you were Mexican or Hispanic or Latin or something like that, um, and brown, right? Like you're not like a white Latin or something, white Mexican, um, then your racial identity, in a sense, denotes that kind of you know, that outsideness to colonial's origins and not colonial's origins, and you know, so I'm sure we could have like a discussion about the new topography's relation to their own, you know, racialized geographies, but I think in large what I just meant to say with that was, you know, if you look at some of their work, I think that their work is obviously in direct response, or, you know, in response to landscape photography as a genre and where that has, um, where that's been led, and, you know, the kind of ways that that made people think about
How you getting now?
the land, you know what I mean? People in certain ways of looking at the land as really this what it is in westerns is kind of escapist. It's like a place um, to kind of vacation, but not just vacation, but to recreate and to, you know, to kind of not have to live with the pressures and with the dynamics that are occurring in society. You know, whether it's an urban space or even like a more rural space, like you're still gonna have, you know, certain accommodations and certain luxuries and certain access. I mean, you could be, you know, I live in the city, but can spend my whole fucking day alone, like on my phone, and can hear people outside, I guess, but like not trying to interact with them. And anyway, so all I meant to say was that landscape photography too, even especially looking at its um, mainstream use and kind of historical use, represents a certain way of looking at wilderness and um, what's considered terra nullius, no man's land. And I kind of think that really even represents a racial geography in a way, because um, so in the book Indian Given, she talks about racial geographies being drawn from this position of the Indio-Barbaro, which was, a kind of like position that she talks about, basically a way of, seeing a kind of like colonial perspective of, and like expectation of, native people, and what kind of native, what the presence of native people then would like kind of represent, um, which was always this kind of underlying like fear of the possibilities of like attack, the possibilities that like they're an enemy, and the kind of not being able to distinguish like who is ever good then, right? Because everybody's a potential enemy. So that's what she talks about with the Mexican American borderlands. Um, but with something like with the geography that we're in this game, the geographies that landscape photography generally brings up, right? Um, do we ever like, which side note, I mean, like, do we ever look at landscape photography and think about like migrants in the desert, or do we think about dangers like inherent to spaces, um, that occupy themselves in movies, right? Like movies have maybe like more of a kind of a narrative ability in that way, and maybe are more effective, or more effective in that way. But um, but landscape photography generally is more melancholy or something. It's not. I don't know. That's the right word. But it's not supposed to be like you know. It historically hasn't been like very existential, right? And so I kind of think personally, as I'm gonna at least try and argue in this paper, is that um, that kind of way of seeing land itself denotes a racialized geography, especially because it denotes the also the lack of presence of native people, because it's this preconceived knowledge that in these spaces, like these spaces aren't the contested spaces of like the Mexican American borderlands, where Mexicans like denote indigeneity and denote the Indio-Barbaro, in contemporary, in the contemporary mind, or even in the American mind, kind of historically. But in this geography, that racial aspect has kind of become the landscape itself pretty fully. Um, you know, because the native person is seen to be part of the land, and therefore kind of symbolically becomes the land in a lot of in a lot of American myth, and a lot of American kind of fiction and stories and kind of ideology, right? Of course, this isn't true, but what I argue is that even though I like this game, is that narratives like this also perpetuate that false reality of what life looked like in a certain period of American expansion. And I argue, I mean, like it's kind of like funny to me because this game is even like based on like in 1899 when the frontier was closing, and no doubt that like it's kind of mythos was like closing its functions and it's like you know whatnot, but the fucking railroad was like finished in like the late 1860s. The U.S. Census in 1890 had declared that they had reached California. I mean, like the 49ers, like people had been in California for how long at that point? It's just the kind of realities I think of what we imagine 1899 to look like in this game, and what people were actually aware of in 1899 are two completely different things. Like, for instance, I think this is more apparent in Red Dead Redemption 1 because of its placement in, in the Mexican-American borderlands in Mexico. It's a little more apparent, and that's how it's like capable of denoting this pastness so well, like it not even denoting, but embodying. To me, I was really surprised, but then I was like, yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense. Like everything, we see a car, blah blah blah. But 1911, I wasn't like cars were around by then. Like what the fuck, And so I started just like thinking more about that shit. And even it's interesting. There's a chapter in this book called Indians at Unexpected Places by Philip J. Deloria. And there's a chapter, it's one of the last chapters on, it's called Technology. Um, and the kind of first image that you kind of come up across in this chapter is a picture of Geronimo and a couple of these like native dudes sitting in a car, sitting in a Model T. And this is a photograph from 1904, right? 1904, and I remember I was just trying to read it because I remember like it was about like this chapter. I can't remember all the specifics, but I remember there was some kind of event that led to basically all this money being put in to um, to like help like natives kind of around. Also, something like cars basically being like in some way cars are really like pushed on to like native reservations, and a lot of people on reservations like ended up starting to have cars in like the early 1980s, 1904 and 1905, like this super common thing. So by 1911, in the Mexican-American borderlands, for them to kind of be displaying this car in such a way as if it's supposed to, I don't know, I mean, like, maybe it's just, like, normal, like, they kind of, I guess it's not, like, magical or anything like that. Maybe I'm, like, over-exaggerating, so feel free to catch me on that. But to me, the way it kind of, it's presented in the very beginning, just the way that it comes off this, they're craning off this, unloading this car, and them are really never given like access to one. We're kind of like made a passenger. We see them and things like that. But to me, I really, I really feel like it's the way that all these factors, an old, Western genre game, an open world, an old-looking world, because Red Dead Redemption didn't look fucking new. It didn't look like, you know, didn't look modern. You know what I mean? To me, um, like why is that? Why we're in 19 fucking 11? Like 4 years before World War I or something? Like pretty. something like that, right? Anyway, so that's kind of my thoughts about the
Awesome.
historicity
Yes,
of
kid.
of
You
this
got a lot
game
on?
and of the first game. And to me, kind of what I wrote a video essay on this back in last November. So it's on my YouTube about this game, and that was is really just using like the trailers because I hadn't really played the game or really watched a lot on it at that point. So it was really only regarding the trailers and like I tried looking back on it to like use for this paper, and I was just like, there's not even enough here to
Awesome.
use. But
Yes, kid.
it
You got a
basically
lot
to me
on?
just gets try. I'm just trying to get my point across that um, that I kind of see that playing with history as a part of the Western genre, but also that playing of history is possible because of racial geographies. It's possible because of racial geographies of Mexican American borderlands in Red Dead Redemption 1. And it's possible in this game, Red Dead Redemption 2, more in in a more northern area, it's possible because of the racial geographies of native absence of space, right? Native dispossession, native removal and placement on to reservations, like they are in this game. I haven't even like gotten to that point yet, but I've like watched it. I watched a bunch of cinematics, watched the whole storyline thing, and so that to me just continues to reinforce that um, the power of all of these like combination of things are in a way rooted by like reinforcing that idea that we already have in a sense of the land at this time in a real historical like setting, you know. So it's no longer fiction. It's moved to reinforce our, you know, real perceptions of this historical time in America, right? So that is really what interests me most about this game and also the Western genre. I really didn't think that I like Westerns until I started to think about, I started to take class and, started to think about them more and read more about them. Just like, holy shit, you know? Um, so, anyhow, that's really where I'm at with this game and trying. That's a perspective I'm coming at. And, I kind of feel like in a way I'm probably less like invested in the game emotionally. Like I was just thinking about it. Like um, I I know what happens, and like I've just been spoiling all this stuff for myself, and like this kind of happened recently too. Like I just like saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and like fucking read total spoiler. Didn't even spoil like the movie necessarily, but like a huge like plot point, and kind of felt like shit for like watching it because I knew, and I was just like, man, that would have been so good experiencing, you know, and most times I really don't give a fuck, but that really kind of hurt. This game, it doesn't really hurt because I just don't necessarily feel like as invested. I really like the first game. I really adored the first game, and um, and was am fully enjoying this one. But for some reason, in these games, the spoilers don't really they don't really do it for me for some reason. I don't know if I'm like too like I feel like I can emotionally respond to the narrative, but like in some ways I don't really care, to be honest. Um, you know, I mean, I don't really care in the sense that like I don't know. Hmm. I guess what I mean is that, I'm thinking about how like the game, well, like, okay, here's 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 how I'm gonna put it in perspective. So the video I watched earlier was a short analysis on this game, but on really like the first like 3 chapters up to this point. I think like I'm on the third chapter, so it's like at the end of this chapter. And the analysis, what's that dude's name? Let me look him up right now. What's this dude? Jacob Geller on YouTube, right? Okay, so Jacob Geller on YouTube had this analysis, and he's talking about, like, I won't spoil anything, but he's talking about the game and basically this chapter I'm at, and it's just really kind of like explaining like what happens and like more kind of talking about his response. It seemed like to the game up to this point. It didn't really seem. I don't know. There was as much an analysis as a commentary or a kind of not review, but you know what I mean, like a criticism without criticism, right? Anyway, whatever it was, analysis. The way he's talking about it, I'm like, man, like he's really like he's talking about like you know the I of the video game, like the I me player, like I'm doing this in the story as Arthur Morgan, right? But he's saying I, and he's saying the we, and so he's really kind of coming at it from a perspective of like I'm the one like playing like the game and making all of these moves, like all these decisions that are happening are mine because like I'm the one controlling the character, and thus comes at it from like a really like even though like it also is like an emotional story, a very emotionally driven story, and it's very sad and as like like shit happens, whatever. So, but like so even though that's true, I think what makes that even more potent, like so much more potent, honestly, to the point where other things are kind of like less, whatever. Even though the writing in the game is great, but what makes it so much more potent is that like we're in the position of like it's happening to us, in a sense. And I mean that's like very similar to what happens, I think, in film and cinema, because we need to empathize with like the main character generally, or like if we don't empathize with like the main character, then like we may probably feel bad. 'Cause why the fuck are we watching? You know, this person do these horrible fucking things, or like whatever they're doing. They're just like not something. Doesn't sit well. But I think that's a lot easier, easier to like of a relation to draw out, to exploit in narrative in a video game, because it makes it such that like we are the ones making these decisions, and therefore we're kind of emotionally invested because of like especially because like the video game like the story, everything requires our our touch. I like listened to this lecture by Tom Gunning a few weeks ago where he talked about like the touch in 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 cinema, or not in cinema. Well, he was talking about the touch in cinema, but he was talking about like the digital touch and how like even on the computer, like we use a cursor, like we select things and blah blah blah. Like we need in some way to kind of like you know touch it, and then digital photography, blah blah blah. Anyway, so I get just from that, like I was just thinking about like the tactileness of like our actions in a video game then, because I'm like, I mean, you could watch in like the previous episodes, I talk about it, where I'm just like riding my horse through mission to mission, and I come up across all these people, all these like little side mission things, and more often than not, they've all been like, "Help! I'm falling off a cliff! Like help! I'm getting attacked by a mountain lion! Like help! Like you don't know what's wrong, but they're just like help, 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 help." And really, I talk about how like it's really this like moral urgency, right? Like this theme that just keeps coming up with all these like things that are happening outside of the main story are all these like morally urgent things that we just need to be like helping. And not even that like we need to be helping, but like if we don't, then it's almost like we should kind of like how are we supposed to feel, right? I mean, you could feel like me and just like not give a shit because that's like where I got to. I was just like, I don't even care about helping. Like, I'm not gonna stop for these people. Like, I sat there and watched a person fall off like the cliff, like in my first playthrough, and I was just like, oh, okay, like that sucks. But it's like, like if like by chance, like I just like didn't hear them like going by, would that make it better? Um, so for me, that's kind of like the part that I'm kind of mean when I said that like I don't really give a shit about it. In a sense that like I'm not really like that emotionally invested where I give a shit about like the moral outcomes of the game necessarily. I mean, like obviously like it'll be like ooh like they shouldn't have died. It would have been cool like to see like their story like go on or whatever. Um, but I'm just not really invested in those kind of like outcomes, I guess. Like I already know that, and maybe not just because I know, but like it's a fucking Rockstar game, so of course like shit's not gonna like go like perfectly perfectly well or anything like that. And of course like we should expect uh you know some things to like slightly disturb us and whatever. But yeah, but not really. I guess yeah, like not super invested in it emotionally, um, in the way that like those things kind of are very obviously at the like at the so much at the center of like everything. Like morality is literally just like bouncing all over the place in this game. Like it's a theme. It's like this symbol talked about constantly about how Arthur Morgan all he does is like talk like about how he's such a bad person, but all he does is do good essentially. And even if you do bad, he still does good because like you can't fucking stop like the main story from happening. So he still eventually does good and like maybe just like deserves it a little bit more. Like what does that say at the end? What does that say if like you're still a good person but you did shitty things? Like you deserve just to die a little more brutal death, or you deserve to go to hell like a little bit more, or something like that. Like, I don't know. But it's bouncing everywhere in this game. Everything that's like happening is occurring in just like such a a moral urgency, and maybe that's how like I mean like I'm not saying that like no like narratives like don't kind of talk about morality in some way, because I think that's like what I mean. I don't know. I mean, I think you can read morality into anything, obviously. But, you know, if morality isn't like a huge part of like the narrative, then obviously it's not gonna fucking come up that much, and you're gonna have a completely different read. But if morality is like this narrative, where every fucking single thing is like surrounded by it, then of course we're gonna like feel the weight of like these decisions. You know what I mean? Like if we're immersed into that, then of course we're gonna fucking feel terrible when like we just want to do good and like everything's like going wrong. You know what I mean? So I'm not like pissing in my own soup or anything because I'm enjoying the game. But it's just like that. That's really what I mean when I like say that like I don't really give a shit about like this narrative. Is like that I think that's what this narrative at least is really tugging on, really tugging on your heartstrings, and really tugging on you know on these like questions of morality. And I'm really just curious like where it'll go and where it ends up. Like I know where it ends up. Keep saying that, but like I'm interested in like all these other things because they're like been so much more involved in kind of building my perspective. Like I said, when I wrote my thing last November, I only watched a trailer. I played the first one, didn't beat it, but I watched all the trailers, for this and some cinematics and blah blah blah, and I had like that kind of perspective. And just by playing this game for, I mean, I've played like probably 8 hours so far. Just had like a wildly evolved perspective. I'm not, I've, like I said, all these things that I've been encountering in the game, like all these people just being like, "Oh help, please," and just like it makes me literally just like not even want to do any of these like stupid things. I'm like, why? Like, why am I? Like, I know it's gonna be something wrong, and I need to, maybe that's pissing my own soup. But anyhow, yeah, that's kind of my perspective. Um, I'm really curious where this will go. I'm like, especially now that like I know what happens, like kind of at the end of this chapter, which I didn't know before. It's very much spoiler for me, but I get what I get. Get what I get. Yeah, and so I'm just kind of like, am I too like emotionally like detached from it? I mean, I don't think completely, but I wish I hadn't watched that spoiler or seen that, read that spoiler for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. To be honest, though, I do regret that. Not gonna lie, it's a fucking good movie too. Anyhow, I don't think I'll be doing much gameplay in this one, but it was nice getting kind of these thoughts out. These things have been kind of simmering on. I'm finally in the portion of my paper where I'm actually writing the analysis, and I'm still working on the analysis for the first game, and that's going pretty well. I need to ramp it up. I need to get some other stuff done, so I really need to kind of ramp it up and hurry up and get it on with. I've been kind of lagging on purpose, and just because I've just been kind of exhausted lately from working on things. Um, but my ultimate goal is the end of the month to have a draft out. So I'll we're working on it soon. So I should be getting I'm kind of like in that sense like I want to play the game a little bit more so that I can get more of a read on Arthur's character. If anything, I'm just going to have to resort to looking at more kind of reading like the storylines again. Honestly, that's kind of what I did when I made my other analysis. Um, and so again, I'm not worried about spoilers, but I definitely need some more things to go on. I have like a pretty good basis on this game so far, I think. But I mean, it's just like I said, it's just every time every everything I play just kind of brings new things to light, obviously, and that's really nice to find, and is obviously pretty invaluable to a an in-depth analysis. So that's kind of what That's what the goal is. But anyhow, I'm gonna go eat some food. Um, Probably pick this up again tomorrow. I'm glad I didn't do any missions though. I'm glad I just kind of like simmered on things, because it's been kind of also difficult to find time to like simmer on things. But I feel like I should also be playing. I feel like I don't really need to do that. Obviously, I can do whatever the fuck I want. Watch it or not watch it. Yeah, and yeah. But I hope you have been watching it, and you know, find any of this relevant. Honestly, which is really what I like am interested in with like this game. I'm not trying to like shit on this game or anything by any of the reads or any of the things that I have on it. I've been enjoying it, but I'm really critical of popular culture or aspects of popular culture in that way, and of the narratives of popular culture, because pretty obviously they really tend to reinforce dominant, uh, you know, ideas in society, which are based in colonialism and racism and sexism and in ideologies of, domination, and these things that I generally oppose in my everyday life, or try to, at least. So, I think it's at least, important or worthwhile to kind of point out the ways that those operate and are reinforced in our everyday lives, whether we mean to or not. I'm not saying that Rockstar is like racist, right? Right? I'm talking about these ideas that are built from like, the cultures that we live in, which are built on these false ideas, largely, right? Like that people settling the West were like civilizing. You know what I mean? Like that there was no one in the land at this point in time. Like all these things are just really part of these like national myths, these colonial myths, and these racial myths, even. You know what I mean? So that's where I'll end it. So, um, yeah. Hope you enjoyed this little different episode playthrough, and hope you power on through and get something out of the rest of my playthrough series. This is Ansel Arnold. Thanks for watching.